All right. Um, it's 1:30 in the morning. And I feel like clarifying my position today. Um, so, just to give some context for those that may not have been there today at Daniel's famous net session, today was the net session was a great talk as usual, but you could say you could probably say me and Jockin really stirred the pot on this net session uh, specifically. But okay, so what is it that I need to clarify? Okay, so some there's a couple of statements that I made, right? Um, that became kind of like the pinpoint focus. So this is the thing, right? I said something in the net session. I said God is different, right? Now, when I said this in the context of the way Badu understands love. Like love for Badu is um, this difference, like love as this difference, right? Seeing the world in the two scene rather than the one scene. Um, but not only do I agree with Badu that love is this difference, so to speak. Um, Unfortunately, I think what got kind of like kind of overstretched was like we kind of focused more on difference rather than like love itself per se. I think that would have maybe grounded our thinking a little bit more. Like, how do we conceptualize and understand love in this context? Is it difference? Is it not difference? Um, because then we like really focus on like the more metaphysical concepts like otherness and this like difference in isolation. Um, but to me, like difference was predicated and imminent in the notion of love. So it couldn't have been placed in like, oh, is there really a difference between like a Republican that has a different job from like another Republican? Like that obviously wouldn't be a difference, right? Um, and that was like an example that got brought up. So that's why I was like, this is why the context of love was like very important for me. But then also the way I explain love as the one thing that's not offered. And one of the so a lot of the topic of debate got centered around ethics, love and ethics. And my biggest beef was I hate it when religion gets reduced to its morals and ethics, essentially. And the famous story, and this is the part that like it's hard to say. So I feel like this kind of goes back to like Susan Sontag's like kind of exposition on like art, where it's like morality and art sort of like morality and aesthetics kind of like you can't really divide the two, so it's just like all there. um but I want to say that, so anyways, the whole Abraham story got brought up, right? And famously, this this Abraham Isaac thing, like the whole Abraham sacrificing his son issue, uh basically becomes like an ethical issue, right? But to me, the reason, like, to me, I think we've been approaching this exegesis kind of like wrong if I'm gonna be like, blunt here. Like I really do feel like we've been approaching the exegesis wrong on this. Um, because to me, the exegesis of Abraham sacrificing his son is not about ethics. It's about love. And I'm going to show you how, if you talk about ethics, what Abraham does makes no sense. But if we talk about love within the context of the way that I define it, which is love is the one thing that cannot be offered, then we can understand why it kind of makes sense, right? Because I honestly feel like everybody fixate on like the most obvious thing, like, oh, he's gonna kill him, right? He's gonna kill his son. Um, and so there was this interesting thing that got brought up where Sam was saying that, like there is something kind of like Kierkegaardian where it's like an ironic, where it's like, uh, like it's like ethically wrong to do what Abraham's about to do, and then like also at the same time, like it's not like, it's like this kind of weird thing. And then Jockin kind of responded back, and at least if I'm recalling correctly, he responded back with like saying, well, technically Abraham didn't do anything ethically wrong because he didn't commit it like last second. God switches out Abraham's son with like, I think like a ram or something, like it, basically another animal. Not another animal, but it switches it with an animal, right? Switches Abraham's son with an animal. So Jockin was like, you see, like there, right there, like nothing like ethically wrong was done. But actually, I'm going to use this point to show that actually it's not about ethics. Like the fact that the whole story of like Abraham's son and like Abraham about to sacrifice his son for God, and how this is like an ethical problem, but then like similarly to Jockin's response, that actually the ethical problem like doesn't actually exist because Abraham doesn't actually kill his son, right? He doesn't actually sacrifice his son. Um Now, of course, like which to be fair, like if we're talking about like actual law and stuff, like you can't like charge, for example, you can't charge Abraham with like manslaughter, right? Because he didn't like kill him. Um so but yeah, my spicy take on the whole Abraham story and the sacrificing of the son is that we keep interpreting it as a sort of ethical problem. And to me, it's not about an ethics at all. But see, that's like the dangerous part for me, because like I was like, are you sure? Like ethics is really important, but like also at the same time, like I don't. I think I want to say that ethics takes a back seat on this. Um, Mainly because, at least when we're talking about the Bible, it seems like the Bible is always between so and so and God, right? Like it's so and so and God. It's never like this, you know, but because it's like it usually follows like this logic of like God and the prophets, like this sort of relationship of two, right? And of course, it tells the stories of like the prophets and their own families and so on. Um, but okay, anyways, let me get to the main point on this. I'm sort of like digressing here. Um, So let's go back to my main assumption in my exegesis, and I'm going to use the story of Abraham to make an example of this. Why I argue love is the more primary hermeneutic for this understanding rather than trying to dissect it ethically and understand it ethically, because obviously ethically it doesn't make any sense. And I think a lot of people, and I think the reason why this story is such a hot button, like it's such a hot button topic, is because ultimately because of fundamentalism. Like people could be like, well, God told me to do this, so I'm going to do this, and then like commit murder. And then it becomes like this crazy thing, right? But if you understand it in that way, you're missing the point. So what's the point? I'm going to try to basically hopefully make this as bare bones, as easily as understandable as possible, because there's going to be a lot of paradoxes here in my reading. There's going to be a lot of paradoxes, but it's going to have to do with what Badu calls, basically it's this thing, but it's this tension between identity and difference, or you could say identity and love, right? But okay, so let's go into it, right? What's my famous phrase, right? Love is the one thing that cannot be offered. All right. So we're going to stick with this notion of offering. So what is God demanding Abraham to do? God is demanding Abraham to offer his son. And if I remember correctly, this is like the son that like Abraham's been waiting for like years to finally have, right? It's like finally he gets a son that's his own, and God's like, hey, sacrifice him for me. Right? Which is really crazy. When you really think about it, it's like I just got him. Why are you asking me to give him away? But anyways, Abraham's willing to do it, basically, right? But then also, if I'm remembering correctly, Abraham's son is also ironically uh like so trusting of his father. Like he really loves his father, and it's almost like he has no doubt about what's going to like I don't if I'm remembering well, I don't think he knows that he's about to get sacrificed, but it's like he just has like this love for his dad that's like he just trusts him, right? Okay, so there's love there in that depiction. And it's hard for Abraham because he loves his son, right? But here's the trap, right? Here's the trap within the whole Abraham story and the son reading, right? The trap is that, and let's add another layer of this hermeneutic, right? If my hermeneutic is about love, my hermeneutic is also about God, right? Because I'm playing with the Christian sentiment of God is love, right? And if love is the one thing that's not offered, here's the thing, right? The moment Abraham chooses love, chooses God, it's the one thing not offered, which means it circles back to Abraham choosing his son. Why? Because if Abraham chooses love, he chooses God. And once you choose God, God loves Abraham. And so, because God loves Abraham, it nullifies the offering. So then love becomes the one thing that is not offered. Like that means that Abraham's son was not going to ever be sacrificed, right? Because that whole interaction between love was nullified. Like the sacrifice itself was going to be already nullified, right? So this is my logic. By Abraham picking God, he picks his son, right? But here's where Abraham would have really fucked up, right? If Abraham would have picked his son over God, and remember, I'm using the Christian sentiment of like loving God as like synonymous. So if he would have picked his son over God, that means he would have picked basically Abraham would have picked himself over love. Because Abraham is identifying himself. He's uh conforming his identity to his son. And remember, like this is in the context of like, I guess you could say biblical times, like having a son is like a huge, like it's a big fucking deal. Like it's the way your progeny continues and it like sort of maintains the identity of the family name, right? So it's a big deal, right? It is basically his identity that God is asking him to sacrifice in this thing, right? So this is why I don't like this reduction of the whole Abraham uh, son thing being an ethical problem. To me, this is a love problem, not ethical problem. And I think the moment you put it in ethical realms, like this is why people are like, it doesn't make any sense, like blah 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 blah, like it's just wrong. Um, but Jockin actually made a really good point on this: is that technically Abraham does nothing wrong because there's a bait and switch right at the end where it's like actually an animal gets offered instead of his son. So it's like, did Abraham do anything wrong? He didn't kill him. If that's what we're talking about. Did he have intentions? Yeah, but again, it's like if you want to put this in like the context of law, like this would be a case of like you'd have to prove that so and so had intentions, and you have to prove that so and so was doing this, like and everything else, right? But again, this whole interaction is solely between God and Abraham and his son. So it's like there is no case essentially to convict that this is what he did wrong, and so on. So this is why I feel like in the context, it's really a problem of love. But back to the point. So because God is synonymous with love, Abraham's only real choice is God. And once he chooses God, he chooses, Abraham ironically chooses his son. And so it does a full circle back. And because love is the one thing that cannot be offered, it goes off the table, right? That means Abraham's son is no longer going to be sacrificed. It's something else that's sacrificed. So, but if we think about love in like a real tangible way, love demands a sacrifice. And what that sacrifice typically entails is your identity. And going from identity to difference. But what's really ironic about this sacrifice from going identity to difference, like, Zizek actually says something really, really, I really agree with Zizek on this notion of love here, where he says, he says, love is like, is not about satisfying needs. Like love is this idea of radically changing for the other, right? So there's already a lot of things here, right? Love is something that demands a radical change in the other, right? And this is like Zizek's understanding too, right? Like when he talks about like love, it's like not about satisfying needs, but about this, like I cannot live without you, so I'm willing to change, right? Like and I'm willing to do this radical transformation. So in that sense, love demands you to give up your identity. But but we have such a fascination with our identity, and yet when we fall in love, it's almost as if that sacrifice goes null, right? Like, and that's what's so surprising to me is that because we love someone, we're like willing to just like, okay, I'm willing to change. Like I'm willing to do something about this difference. Like I'm willing to compensate and make changes to accommodate all the difference between you and me. And because I love you, right? And so that sacrifice, even though it is a sacrifice, you're sacrificing your identity. It Because it's for love, it nullifies the sacrifice, because it's like it's not even a sacrifice anymore. Because for us, even as human beings, with just having love relationships with each other, love itself is so grand on the scheme of things that it just doesn't matter. Like that sacrifice isn't uh, important, so to speak. It just there's like a double negation that happens, and that's why it's not even a sacrifice. But what's funny about this, when I say that love is the one thing that is not offered, love does demand an offering. It does demand an offering. And just like Daniel Gardner kind of quoted in the net, the famous Rilke poem about, you must change your life. Love demands something like that, right? It asks you to offer something. And when we really think about love, and even in the Badu sense, um, we offer up our identity. And in that offering of our identity, that sacrificing, because love, the way it is and the way it functions, and of course, this is the part that gets hard to really explain why this is so. But I think phenomenology speaking, we can all probably relate in some ways, and why love is so painful for us, and why we always want to go back to being in love and in this battle with it, is because that sacrifice of our identity becomes so small and void because of the joys of love, right? The joy and the labors of love sort of completely outweigh the sacrifice to such a degree that it just goes null. And so now we can look at the whole Abraham story of sacrificing his son, that if God is love, and I'm playing with the Christian like presuppositions here, like creatively playing with them, and also tying in a little bit of Lacan, a little bit of Badu, but not really so much. I'm kind of making their own notions of love my own, which I reduce to love is the one thing not offered, and difference. You can see that by the only real choice that Abraham makes is choosing love. And once he chooses love, the sacrifice goes null. Why? Because not only does in that moment Abraham says, yes, I love you, God. I choose love. God in response says, because you choose me, because you are committed to me, I fulfill my promise, right? That, and then he switches, and he switches it, right? Like it's really this notion of commitment, right? This is why I like the story of Abraham and the son, because it's really this story of love saying to Abraham, and I'm substituting love and God here, love saying to Abraham, are you committed to me? Are you committed? And in order for you to show me that you're committed, you have to sacrifice something. And the way I'm interpreting Abraham's son is Abraham's identity. Because if Abraham chooses his son over God, he's choosing his identity. He's actually not choosing his son. Like this is the most ironic part of it all, of what I'm saying. But if Abraham chooses God, chooses love, he ironically chooses his son. Because then love in return reciprocates, right? Love is a sort of commitment, it's a promise. And so in this reciprocation, in this promise, the sacrifice goes null, right? And this even goes back to like the chapter on Romans where like love fulfills the law, you know? Like because what God was really asking Abraham was like, I mean, probably for most parents this would be like impossible. Like what you're asking this man to do is impossible. But this asking is where we keep thinking in the realm of ethics. But if we don't think in the realm of ethics and we think about love itself and what it demands, it begins to make more sense. You know, because actually I think thinking in the realm of ethics, this is where this is where we get the notion of like fundamentalism, basically. God told me to do this, so now killed all these people. you know, but like no, it's not that at all. It's this notion of love, um, and how the sacrifice nulls itself in the face of that love. So hopefully, hopefully I've made that like as clear as possible. That if Abraham chooses love, he actually ironically chooses his son, because by choosing God, he chooses his son. Really. And Kierkegaard talks about the ironic thing about the choice, where it's like, you wouldn't even be able to choose like the worst option if it weren't for God, you know? But this ironic twist about like, if God is the very thing that allows us choice, then choosing God is essentially choosing the best option. And so there's this funny thing where it's like, because Abraham chooses God, it ironically chooses his son, right? Because and it's again, to how can I explain this? It's like, because Isaac's like, because Abraham's like, okay, I love you, God, I choose you. And then God goes, okay, you've declared that you love me and you're committed to me, but because I love you and I know that you love your son, it goes null. Like the sacrifice goes null, right? So hopefully, and that's how it connects to basically, if Abraham chooses God, he chooses his son. That's how it circles back. But he has to choose love, choose God, in order for him to choose his son, not the other way around. Because actually, if he chooses his son first, it's actually selfishness that he's choosing, right? Because now, if you're understanding the context of like Abraham and his predicament, is like he couldn't have a son for a long time. And finally, he got a son at a very old age, if I'm remembering correctly again. And then now all of a sudden, God asked him to give it up, to sacrifice it. So this is, to me, a tension, an offering of identity, right? Because again, context of this, sons were really important back then, because that was the sign of continuing the line, the progeny, and the blessing, so to speak, right? So I think that's really important. So love is the one thing that cannot be offered, and this is why Abraham's son is not offered in the end. because the whole thing is about love. And that's why something else is offered instead. Now, Michelle asked me a really good question in response to my exegesis on this exact topic. And just to kind of give her like summary, she basically said like, you know, she likes this exegesis, but it gets a little bit like she's wondering like how can we make sense of this in terms of like when God the Son, like Jesus, kind of offers himself on the cross, so to speak, like he goes through like a sacrifice. Except, for her, the real difference is that Jesus actually does get sacrificed. Like he actually does get sacrificed. So it definitely makes it different from the Abraham story where Abraham's son technically doesn't get sacrificed. But in the case of Jesus, God as man as God, he does get sacrificed. So Michelle's basically asking me like, how do we make sense of this? And it's a really good question. But if we go back to the main assumptions that I've been saying, right? This interchange between God is love and God, loving God, the synonymous aspect. Let's substitute instead of love, because I've been saying love is the one thing that cannot be offered. I'm going to say God is the one thing that cannot be offered. Okay. Now, how do we make sense of this like blatant contradiction of the fact that Jesus does get sacrificed, right? Well, you see, what I like about this is that Jesus, right, for the sake of better words, right, we interpret him as God, right? But what's ironic about this is that God, if love demands an offering, God has to offer something, right? Like he actually has to offer something. And the only way for him to tangibly offer something is to offer his only son, right? This is the Christian paradigm. He gives his only son, right? So he has to offer something as a sign of love. But the moment this offering goes through, and I think with God in this context, it actually has to go through. Like the offering actually has to happen to show you the nullification of it, which results in the resurrection. Like it results in the full resurrection. So there's a sense in which, the resurrection itself nullifies the sacrifice, you could say. But this is definitely a hot button topic because people are like, well, wait a second. If it nullifies the sacrifice, that means that it possibly nullifies the fact that God died for all of our sins. You know what I mean? Like then sin, didn't get cleared, and then we didn't get a new kind of a new slate for this, right? It throws a lot of tension in the theologies of Christianity, right? The notion of baptism, the notion of everything else. Like this causes a lot of disruption in what I'm saying. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, part of me takes an enjoyment of that because I'm not like I don't care too much about doctrines, so to speak, but just to kind of appeal in a more honest way, I will put it this way. So because love itself is greater than the offering, it's actually the other way around. Like, it's not the sacrifice itself that is so great that it eradicates all sin. Like, it's not that. So it's a matter of emphasis. Like, people think, oh, look, the sacrifice was so great, it nullified sin, and so now it gave us all a blank slate and so on. I am redistributing that emphasis. I'm saying, actually, because love is so great, it nullifies the sacrifice. It was actually love itself that sort of does the work of cleansing the sin and giving us a new slate, right? But in order for that to happen, and I think this to me, this is the difference between people arguing against to another person, being like, look, I sacrificed for you, like, and you treat me like garbage. um you see what's ironic about that kind of sentiment, that is even shared in like our actual love relationships, when someone says, look how much I sacrificed for you and you treat me like garbage. The moment somebody says that, you are reducing the other person to a kind of exchange. Like, but if you do that, if you say, oh, I'm sacrificing myself for you and you're not doing anything for me, what you're doing is you're not actually sacrificing yourself. You are sacrificing yourself as a guise to get some type of exchange. And so this is why, in my opinion, the sacrifice cannot be reduced to this exchange of, oh, Jesus sacrificed himself, cleanses sin. No. Um, it's more like Eric Fromm's notion of sacrifice, where you sacrifice because, like, there is no exchange. You sacrifice for the sake of sacrificing because you love them. And so then, because you love them, this is the part, right? That means actually love itself is the reason for the sacrifice. It's not that the sacrifice is what eradicates the sin. It's the love itself that eradicates the sin, so to speak, within the Christian doctrine, not the sacrifice. The sacrifice is there as the expression of that love, but it's not that exchange. It's not that element of exchange, in my opinion. So it's a matter of redistributing that emphasis towards love again, rather than fixating on that notion of sacrifice. Like, oh, he sacrificed, blah 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 blah. But see, to me, like, this is what I feel like. You reduce God to like this exchange, but it's really not a matter of exchange. It's the fact that there was this love that sort of nullifies the sacrifice. But because love is so paradoxical, love is the one thing that cannot be offered, and yet love demands an offering. To show you, love demands an offering to show you love is the one thing that cannot be offered. And that, to me, is the biggest paradox in understanding, like, God sacrificing himself as man, Jesus, and then resurrection. Like, this is like the whole paradigm to me. Like, and what's funny is that you could even go so far as to say, at least with my exegesis, you could go so far as to say that once love demands an offering and you go through with it, it nullifies the sacrifice. Hence Jesus's resurrection. But also, this is when you encounter difference, right? And if you go back to the Bible, when God gets resurrected, when Jesus gets resurrected, the disciples notice that there's something different about him. He's actually not like in the same body. That's what they realize. Like, there is something like different about this body that Jesus has. Like, it's not like an actual like same body. He has the wounds of the sacrifice, but it's not the same body per se. There's something different about his body. And the disciples talk about this. They're like, there's something different about his body. Um, and so for me, this is the emergence of love as difference, and also how love nullifies the sacrifice. But love demands an offering too, right? Love demands an offering only to show you that love is the one thing that cannot be offered. And so hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that sort of resounds in some way, and maybe that's a interesting way of reading, or maybe it's just a horrible way of reading it for you guys. But um, I really enjoy combining Padu's notion of love is difference, and then also combining Lacan's notion of love with, giving something that you don't have to somebody that doesn't want it. But I've kind of basically, I mean, maybe I shouldn't even be calling it like Badu or like Lacan's reading anymore, because I'm sort of just combining them, and I'm making it my own, and I'm reducing Lacan's sentiment to, love is the one thing that cannot be offered. But then now I'm adding an addition to that statement where I'm saying, but also love demands an offering. And it's that sort of necessary element of love demands an offering for you to understand that love is the one thing that cannot be offered. And so in that sense, you understand that whatever you sacrifice for love's demand goes null in the face of love. But yes, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that. I figured it was really important for me to kind of go through some clarifications on, my exegesis and like the ground that I'm coming from, and the reason why I'm sort of interpreting the Bible in this manner, and so on. But yeah, anyways, hope you guys enjoy. Bye.